Frank Gaffney. I'm the Executive Chairman of the Center for Security Policy. I also am the President of Save the Persecuted Christians, but I'm here in a different capacity today at this beautiful Kirby Center of the Hillsdale College. And that is in my role as the Vice Chairman of the Committee on the Present Danger China. A relatively new organization. It began in March of this year. This is our 8th event, threat briefings we call them. The previous 7 are all available online at presentdangerchina.org, and I very strongly commend them to you as a great resource on the various aspects of the threat we face from the Chinese Communist Party and the various institutions and indeed the country that it now is using, I believe, as instruments of unrestricted warfare, to use their term, against the United States of America. As important as the various contributions that have been made in our previous programs, 4 of them here in Washington, D.C., 1 each in New York City, in Chicago, and in Dallas, we have, I believe, made a signal contribution as well by offering specific suggestions about what American policymakers, and indeed the free world more generally, should be doing about the threat posed in these various ways by the Chinese Communist Party. In short, we believe that the role of this committee, about which you'll hear more in a moment from our chairman, Brian Kennedy, is to raise awareness about the present danger, the existential threat to freedom, as Ronald Reagan used to describe it, that is posed to us in our time by Communist China under the Chinese Communist Party. We're here to talk about an extraordinarily important topic. It's, I think, hard to exaggerate just how important it is. To give you a short course on it, Vladimir Lenin was perhaps wrongly credited with a formulation that he certainly practiced during the early days of the Soviet Union. He noted, we're told, that the capitalists will sell us the rope with which we will hang them. What we're going to document in the course of today's threat briefing with a remarkable array of accomplished national security practitioners, financial leaders, and other subject matter experts, as well as several important legislators, both serving and now retired, is that today, the United States of America and capitalists elsewhere are buying the rope with which Communist China intends to hang us. We will, I think, persuasively make the case that that is not only insane, but it is extraordinarily reckless to our country and to, indeed, the free world more generally. With that, I'm going to turn this over to Brian Kennedy. He is, in addition to being the chairman of the Committee on the Present Danger China, the former president of the Claremont Institute, one of the most important think tanks in America, and currently the president of the American Strategy Group. He is the author of a forthcoming book on existential threats, which will put him perfectly situated to talk about this one. Brian Kennedy.
Thank you, Frank. Thank you, everyone, for joining us both here today at Hillsdale College and also those who are watching the live stream. Hillsdale College is a great place, a great institution in America, one of the few places where freedom is defended every day. It's run today by an old friend of mine, Larry Arnn, who 30 years ago, literally, was president of the Claremont Institute and hired me to work with him back then. So I have a long affiliation with Larry and Hillsdale, and it's an outstanding place. And this Kirby Center is run by Matt Spalding, who's also a real champion for freedom here in Washington, D.C. Well, as Frank said, my name is Brian Kennedy. Our purpose with this committee meeting is to explain the threat posed by the People's Republic of China and the Chinese Communist Party to the safety and prosperity of the United States. As we were organizing all this, I was reminded, and Frank mentioned that line about, we will sell them the rope, then talking about the Soviet Union. And as Frank said, today we'll buy the rope for them, but to add a particular point, first we will lend them the money with which to buy the rope, adding a certain kind of madness to our collective suicide. One key area, of course, of all of economic warfare that we're seeing today is the subject of modern finance. The PRC, need I say, has been waging an economic war against the United States for the past 30 years. As President Trump has said, the war was fought and we lost. Much to his credit, he is doing everything in his power to get us back on track when it comes to economic relations. He's doing so against every moneyed interest on Wall Street and in the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, both of whom are enamored with and influenced by the PRC. President Trump has waged a counterattack on what has transpired before now with his America First approach. Whether it is the PRC's unfair trading practices, their theft of intellectual property, or forced technology transfers, the president has staked his presidency on holding the PRC to account. But of course, there is still more to do. The United States has yet to hold the PRC to account when it comes to their defaulted sovereign debt, a debt of over $1 trillion to 20,000 American families in 46 states, and by extension, owed to the American people themselves. We also have the issue we are examining today in this meeting of the committee, the PRC's penetration of U.S. capital markets and the danger it poses to U.S. investors and the economic health and reliability of U.S. capital markets. We've assembled an impressive group of people, all of whom have spent many years examining this issue, understanding the complexity of, and in many ways the simplicity of, why the U.S. capital markets are here for the benefit of the U.S. people. We would not be having this conversation, of course, if we as a people did not suffer a certain kind of intellectual corruption when it comes to our relations with the People's Republic of China. Globalism, which is the dominant ideology in so many ways that governs Washington, presents itself as a kind of all-encompassing good not to be questioned. In this globalist mindset that has captured at least Wall Street, there should be unfettered access to U.S. capital markets by the PRC and its state-owned enterprises. It matters not that they are in competition with U.S. companies seeking capital themselves, or the political implications of having millions of U.S. retirees invested in PRC state-owned enterprises, investing, in effect, in the success of the PRC and the Chinese Communist Party. It would be one thing if the PRC was well advanced in its march toward democratic capitalism, a respect for human rights, and the establishment of the rule of law. Unfortunately, none of these are the case. The PRC presents, as we know, a unique challenge given their determination and the strategic capabilities of the Chinese Communist Party and their ruthless hold over the country. Witness current actions in Hong Kong. It is our sincere hope today with this meeting to bring to light the intersection of global finance and the national security requirements of the United States. We hope this leads to a series of policy recommendations that align with President Trump's America First foreign policy and the ongoing defense of these United States. With that, let me thank you again for joining us here today and turn this back over to my colleague, Frank Gaffney. Thank you, Brian.
One of the senior legislators who has taken lead dog position on this issue of American investments being put at the service of our enemy, Communist China, is Senator Marco Rubio from Florida. He has had a few other things on his plate of late, thanks to Hurricane Dorian, and could not be with us in person today, I'm sorry to say. But we did want to give a shout out to him, both for communications that he has led on with respect to the Morgan Stanley MSCI index, which is one of the most important vehicles through which this financing of Communist China's nefarious activities is taking place. Again, you'll hear much more about this in the course of the morning. He has also, most recently, written, along with Democrat Senator Jeanne Shaheen from New Hampshire, a letter to the board that oversees the federal retirement system's Thrift Savings Plan. And he spoke about this earlier this week on CNBC. And we have a short clip of his comments, which I think set the stage for this morning's drill down. So let's go to CNBC.
With a list of U.S. products it plans to exempt from tariffs, including items like animal feed ingredients and lubricants and some cancer drugs. The question now, whether this could provide an opening for goodwill or progress as negotiators get ready for new trade talks. Joining us now for his take on where things stand, as well as the tensions in Hong Kong and more, Senator Marco Rubio of Florida. Great to have you. Have been a while, Senator. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
The thing I think we need, we'll start talking about something that you have an interest in, and that is that you need, I guess, to look closely at investments from time to time to see exactly where things are headed. And the MSCI index contains a lot of companies, Shanghai companies. And if our retirees, government retirees, are investing in that, it seems counterproductive to everything we're trying to accomplish here.
Well, there's two aspects to that. The first is what you've outlined, and a lot of these are government-backed or government-controlled companies. In fact, there is really no such thing as private companies in China compared to what we have in the West, and certainly in the United States. They are all, to some extent, instruments of state power. And so the first question is whether U.S. investment dollars should be propping up these companies that are actively seeking to undermine U.S. economic and national interest. But the second point is the transparency part of it. You know, when you sell securities on U.S. markets and exchanges, there are transparency requirements. You have to be able to go see the audits. Why? Because you want shareholders to be protected. There's disclosure requirements, things that you want people to know about those companies, the risks they're running, the decisions they're making, and how they're being managed. We don't have that insight when it comes to these Chinese-controlled companies. The Chinese require all of these records to be kept in the mainland, and they block our ability, our regulators' ability to go in and see and so what's going on truly behind the scenes. And so you have American investors, including federal employees through the retirement program, the TSP program, investing their hard-earned dollars for their future retirement into companies which we have no oversight in comparison to virtually every other company on these being sold, selling securities on our exchanges and on our markets.
Seems like you could get some bipartisan support for this, right? To stop it. Is that in the works?
And it is. And our bill is bipartisan, and it's a new issue. A lot of people aren't aware of this. Frankly, I learned about this about a year and a half ago, and it's an extraordinary risk moving forward. You can imagine how much leverage that is to a U.S. Against the United States that it gives China. But then there's just, irrespective of everything else, I think the question, really the fundamental question on this and on various topics when it regards China is, how come their companies, their firms, and in this case, those companies that are publicly traded, why don't they have to meet the same standards as American companies have to meet or other companies have to meet, in this case in terms of transparency and the ability of regulators to go in and see what's going on and provide that information to the shareholders and those who are trading, including at the retail level.
Can I ask a question? Senator, last week General Mattis made an interesting comment, which was you can't expect an authoritarian, control freak, he didn't use that term, but communist, intrusive government at home, China, to be a force for liberalization and capitalism abroad. And you can't square that circle.
Yeah.
I assume you agree with that. I mean, this is the disconnect that we have in trying to deal with China in financial terms.
Yeah, well, that's exactly right. I mean, frankly, their political culture is not one that they don't view things the same way that we do. These are not government leaders that somehow understand our system and have decided to go in a different direction. They have a very fundamental different view of everything from human rights to what real democracy means. Now, here's what happens with China, okay? They are and are going to continue to develop into a great power. This is not about containment. This is not about stopping their rise. This is about, however, having a proper balance in our relationship with them, which is growing increasingly unbalanced, frankly, because we have made the mistake as policymakers in this city for a long time of ascribing to the Chinese government and the Chinese system attributes of our own system. We see a Chinese company and we say, well, they're just a corporation like one of ours. No, they're not. American corporations don't have dedicated seats on the board and don't have employees representing the governing party of the country. They do in China. And to prove that, how they're used as an instrument of power, you look at these business and investment deals they make all around the world, most of them make no economic sense in terms of profit and loss. They are subsidized by the government because they are used for policy aims. It's how they're getting their foothold on telecommunication. It's how they're getting their foothold on various different industries.
I very much appreciate the Senator's leadership in this space and want to call attention, as we will in a few minutes, to a piece of legislation that he has introduced, again on a bipartisan basis, the Equitable Act. Kyle Bass will be joining us by video to talk about that in a minute, but we're sorry that he couldn't be here with us today. We hope to have him at a future threat briefing, but deeply appreciate what he is doing to call attention to and begin the process of rectifying this terrible mistake in terms of enabling our enemies. Someone else who also has served with great distinction in the United States Congress wanted to be with us but couldn't be here in person and was kind enough to do a short video. I apologize in advance. The audio is a little bit muted, I'm told, but hopefully it's audible, and we'll pick it up for those of you live streaming and watching this subsequently. But he is, of course, House Speaker Newt Gingrich, now a private citizen, alas, but a man who had served with great distinction in the House of Representatives. He has been very engaged on the various threats that we're facing to our country, both foreign and domestic, and has been particularly, I think, eloquent in describing the danger that communist China represents today. I'm very pleased to have a short video from him talking about that threat and setting up our visit with you today. Speaker Gingrich.
I want to thank Frank Gaffney for his leadership, the Committee on Present Danger focusing on China. This is a very, very important step in the right direction. And I particularly want to talk just for a minute about thrift savings plans, and behind that, the larger question of giving Chinese companies access to the American capital markets. We really have had a deficit, if you will, whether the Securities Exchange Commission or various other organizations, in allowing Chinese companies to come into the system with far fewer problems, far less stringent demands, and we've now seen that extended all the way to the federal thrift saving plan, allowing Chinese companies to be part of the investment for American government employees and their retirement program. This is really wrong, and it's wrong because we are providing the capital for the Chinese to build up their capabilities. And in fact, in some of the cases, the companies are companies that actually run various and sundry repressive police state programs that we actually sanction in other zones. So I want to encourage you to have this session. I want to encourage you to reach out to the financial community and educate them, people don't realize, first, how great a challenge China is going to be. They don't realize, second, how much American capital has been part of developing the Chinese economy. And they don't realize, third, that we have the wrong set of rules. And we actually, in some cases, make it easier for a Chinese company than for an American company to acquire capital. All of this has to be changed if America is going to survive. And I appreciate Frank and the entire team, the work they're putting into getting those changes. So thank you.
Thank you, Speaker Gingrich, and for your leadership. I should have mentioned, and will now, that he is communicating on this particular topic to audiences far beyond ours. Most recently, on the 4th of September, he authored an op-ed piece in the Hill newspaper entitled, "Chinese Investments Put U.S. Government Retirement Funds at Risk." It's a really required reading. I commend it to all of you. We have, I'm very pleased to say, with us a member of the House of Representatives currently serving, who has brought to his present role as a member of the House Armed Services Committee both some very important experience in the military itself, as well as in public life in his home state of Indiana. He is Congressman Jim Banks. He served during his time in the State Senate of Indiana in Afghanistan as a naval supply officer, for which we particularly thank him, but also has been a leader on this particular issue of, as the Speaker indicated, having the retirement funds of U.S. government employees, past, like Speaker Gingrich and myself, and present, like Congressman Banks and countless others, invested in communist China, in companies it owns and operates for a variety of purposes, many of which are very, very detrimental to our security interests and, you know, that of others around the world. Among other things, I do want to specifically salute Congressman Banks for his leadership in introducing the Blocking Investing in Our Adversaries Act, H.R. 2903. We hope very much that this program will encourage you, sir, and your colleagues to move forward smartly on that act. Welcome. Very glad to have you, Congressman Breyer.
Well, good morning, and thank you for the invitation to speak on this important topic with you today. As we've already talked about, our national security challenges with China are increasingly complex and demand our full attention. I appreciate the focus of today's event and the opportunity to discuss some of my legislative efforts to preserve American leadership. As a member of the House Armed Services Committee, I interpret the President's national security strategy and the National Defense Strategy as a call to action. In my 2.5 years in Congress, I've written several bills to support a whole-of-government approach against our adversaries. Last year and this year, I introduced the Protect Our Universities Act to combat espionage targeting advanced defense-related technology research on college campuses. I also recently introduced a bill to prevent malicious technology companies linked to the Chinese government from hiring U.S. national security professionals to lobby on their behalf. China's persistent attempts to steal military blueprints and sensitive data must be addressed by Congress with eyes wide open. But today I'm here to focus on another initiative. In May, I introduced H.R. 2903, the Blocking Investment in Our Adversaries Act, with the intention of reversing a controversial decision by the Federal Retirement Thrift Investment Board in November of 2017. If allowed to continue, the Thrift Savings Plan is scheduled to invest in the MSCI ACWI index by next year. Under this index, federal employees' retirement plans would contribute to Chinese, Russian, and other potentially problematic economies. Companies included in the index include ZTE Corporation, High-K Vision, and the Aviation Industry Corporation of China, all three of which support the Chinese government in a technological or military capacity. It seems ironic that federal employees' funds would be used to support our adversaries. Many of these employees spend their entire career countering adversarial actions by countries like China. So I appreciate this group's attention to this issue, as well as Senator Rubio and Senator Shaheen's bipartisan letter to the chairman of the Federal Retirement Thrift Investment Board. In an era of competition with China and Russia, the United States must formulate a whole-of-government approach to prevent unnecessary economic support to either nation. Thank you. I look forward to continuing this important discussion with you today. Lindsay on my team will pass out a handout on our bill. The most important thing that you can do to help us today is draw attention to this piece of legislation, call on other members of the House of Representatives to support our initiative by co-sponsoring the bill. The information that we're passing out to you today will equip you with the information to do that. Thank you again, Frank. It's a privilege to be with you today.
We're going to go to the videotape once again to hear from a colleague, a member of the Committee on the Present Danger, China, who could not be with us today. He's based in Dallas, Texas, where he is the founder and chief investment officer of Heyman Capital. He is quite well known for his activities in the financial space with respect to China, Hong Kong, and his understanding particularly of the threat that China poses to us, and as you'll hear, his very real concerns about the degree to which, through our capital markets, China is enlisting unwittingly, mostly, American investors for quite nefarious purposes. If we can go to the videotape, his name is Kyle Bass. We're pleased to have him here virtually.
Welcome to the Committee on Present Danger, China. Thanks to Brian and Frank and Steve and the rest of the crew at the committee. I'm sorry I can't be there today, but I do want to video in and talk a little bit about China's access to the U.S. capital markets and some of the things that have gone on for a long time where basically people have put their heads in their sand, including ERISA fiduciaries and other fiduciaries of even U.S. military personnel are now sending capital abroad and basically funding China's malevolent ideology across the sea. So I think it's important to talk about two things that are going on. One of course, is the U.S. government and the TSP deciding to potentially invest their capital and index it to MSCI World Indices, which by definition forces capital to invest in companies that are not Dodd-Frank compliant or don't submit themselves to U.S. Public Accounting Oversight Board covered auditors. And you know, it just seems to me that you have this war that China's fighting on four fronts, right? They fight the information war, they fight the economic war, they fight the cyber war. The only war we're not fighting with China is the kinetic war. And from an investment management perspective, all global investment fiduciaries can't wait to invest another dime in China or dollar in China. And I think when we think about this from the perspective of U.S. national security policy and/or policy of the jobs that have been lost in the U.S. and the Rust Belt to the Chinese and outsourcing our jobs to China, I think when we think about investment fiduciaries, we're not doing our job when, as a fiduciary, especially under ERISA, there's this prudent man policy. Being prudent does not mean investing in a company that's not Dodd-Frank compliant or investing in a company that doesn't submit itself to an audit because China deems that all of their state-owned companies to basically hold state or national secrets, and therefore they can't be audited by U.S. Western or covered auditors. I think what we've got to do as a country is, number one, stop investing our military's retirement funds are forcibly investing their money in China. And as the TSP-CIO recently said, he doesn't want to politicize this process. He wants to be able to be free to do whatever he wants to do. But as we all know at the Committee on the Present Danger of China, we're dealing with a regime that live organ harvests, that has up to 3 million political prisoners in jail just due to their religious preference, and steals $200 to $580 billion worth of intellectual property from the United States every year, as per the U.S. Trade Report to the White House earlier this year. All of those things move together, and as we think about that from an investment management perspective, we just seem to put our head in the sand. And I think fiduciaries should be held to a higher standard, and fiduciaries should be forced to invest only in companies that are compliant with U.S. securities laws. Again, think about what I just said for a second. We should force our fiduciaries to only invest in companies that comply with U.S. law. That actually isn't a great leap. That isn't a tough step to take. So far, what we've done is simply turned a blind eye and put our head in the sand as fiduciaries and invested in China. The problem is we're investing in companies that are providing the surveillance equipment and surveillance know-how to basically take those political prisoners in Xinjiang and sometimes even build the concentration camps. Hell, the World Bank has a $100 million loan to Xinjiang today that U.S. taxpayers back so that they could build the concentration camps for their political prisoners. This kind of craziness has to stop. And I think Rubio's new Equitable Act is a very important bill. It's a bipartisan attempt to stop the capital flow to China. And I think that if we pay a lot of attention to enforcing and reinforcing the Equitable Act as we go forward and supporting Rubio, Menendez, all the Republicans and Democrats as we move forward, I think it's very important for all of us on the Committee on the Present Danger to basically help that bill get through Congress. And I actually believe it can pass with a veto-proof supermajority. When we on the Committee on the Present Danger of China think about what Marco Rubio and his committee are putting together with the Equitable Act, very important to support all of the aspects of that act. In fact, the first iteration of that legislation will be changed in the coming weeks, and the new changes will actually further restrict capital from moving to China. Number one, the first iteration talked about delisting Chinese companies from the U.S. when they don't comply with Dodd-Frank standards and or submitting themselves to a PCAOB audit. We need to take that and use ERISA and the Department of Labor to force ERISA fiduciaries to not invest in or prohibit them from investing in foreign companies that also don't apply or comply with Dodd-Frank standards and or covered auditor oversight. And these seem to be somewhat easy steps to take, although the investment world can't wait to invest another shekel in a Chinese company because what China does is it corrupts a few and it makes them very wealthy. And you all know that there are certain billionaires out there that are the greatest lobbyists for China with our administration, in both the Obama administration and the Trump administration. And we have to see through that and basically say, no more U.S. dollars investing in companies that don't have real audits and that aren't Dodd-Frank compliant. And Frank and Brian and the rest of everyone at the Committee on the Present Danger, those are the single most important things that we can do to stop the flow of capital. And what I mean by capital is U.S. dollars to China. China's desperately short dollars, as we saw just 2 days ago, where they magically opened up investment quotas in their QFII and our QFII accounts, which clearly they weren't even close to those limits. And yet they said, our doors are open for capital to come in, and as I think it says the spider to the fly. We need to stop our capital from going over there. We need to stop U.S. dollars from building up the Chinese military, from building up their surveillance state, from building up the machine that does nothing but work against the United States over the long run. So thank you for listening today, and I look forward to seeing the next iteration of the Equitable Act and the committee's support therein.
Thank you very much, Kyle Bass. We hope to have him here in the flesh on our next meeting, but we're very appreciative of him joining us by video. We have one other video, as it happens, also from one of our Dallas-based members of the Committee on the Present Danger. His name is Kevin Freeman. He is the author of two very important books, Secret Weapon and Game Plan, the driving force behind globaleconomicwarfare.com, a blog on economic warfare. And he is the host of a Blaze TV program called Economic War Room with Kevin Freeman. It's an extraordinarily high-quality program addressing these sorts of issues in detail and equipping its audience with blueprints for what can be done about the various action items that the program at Blaze TV identifies. Kevin is, among other things, I'm happy to say, a senior fellow of the Center for Security Policy, as well as a member of the Committee on the Present Danger, founding member at that. Let's go to a video clip from Kevin Freeman on this issue of...
Hi, I'm Kevin Freeman, and I'm honored to be a part of the Committee on the Present Danger, China. I'd like to tell you a quick story. Early in my career, I had the opportunity to be mentored by and employed by the great Sir John Marks Templeton, probably the greatest global investor in history. He was a pioneer in global investing. And when I joined the firm, starting 1989-1990 timeframe, he was teaching me about financial indices, something we're talking about today. The MSCI World Index was the popular index, and everybody was piling into it because it was heavily weighted toward Japanese stocks. Sir John cautioned me. He said, hey, don't give over your investment decision to an index because you don't know what's going to happen in Japan. And in fact, he was one of the early investors in Japan, but he was also the first one to pull out entirely. The Japanese index peaked at 38,900 in 1989, and it destroyed the investments of all of those who trusted the index over the next several decades. In fact, it traded as low as the 6,000 level just about 10 years ago. Sir John would say, why would you give up control to an index? That was when it was simply an investment decision. What's taking place now is far more sinister. China has learned how to game our addiction to market indices with plans to capture a lot of American money for their side. Now, we all know we're in an economic war with China. Why should we fund both sides of it? This is really basic. You don't give up your capital. What's worse is we have no idea how real the investments are inside the index. The Chinese don't have the same accounting standards. They don't report the same way we do. And in fact, there's evidence from Dan David and others that maybe some of these companies are complete shams. Should we allow a single influenceable entity, such as MSCI, to determine where the money of patriotic Americans goes, including service members, government employees, and former employees? It truly would be a ridiculous decision for the board to decide that they're going to put our Thrift Savings Plan heavily, $500 billion, into MSCI World's Index. That's crazy. It makes no sense from an investment perspective, and it's truly criminal from a national security perspective. I truly support the Committee on the Present Danger, China, and I support Senator Rubio and all of those who oppose having the Thrift Savings Plan put into Chinese equities via an index fund. In the Economic War Room, we have a saying where we say, what we see as a marketplace, our enemies view as a battle space. This is absolutely true in regard to this decision. This isn't just a thrift savings plan. This is a battleground of economic warfare. We must not give here. This is Kevin Freeman from the Economic War Room.
Kevin, thank you so much. This tees up very nicely our next speaker, who has done incalculably important work on this particular topic, among many others. His name is Roger Robinson. He formerly served with great distinction as the Senior Director for International Economic Affairs under President Reagan, after service as a Vice President of the Chase Manhattan Bank and a Special Assistant to its Chairman for many years, David Rockefeller. Roger Robinson is these days the Chairman of the Prague Security Studies Institute, based, of course, in the Czech Republic. He is also the president and founder of RWR Advisory Group. I commend to you his Intel Track product there, which allows you to monitor what China and Russia are doing in the way of investing overseas, including here. But he has also been extraordinarily impactful, I think, both in his own right and in presentations that he's made now twice before at threat briefings of the Committee on the Present Danger of China. We're very pleased to have him with us. Roger Robinson.
Well, it's a pleasure to be back before the committee. I think you've already heard some rather stunning revelations here today from Representative Jim Banks, from Kyle Bass, Speaker Gingrich, the works of Senator Rubio, who's been a consistent, dogged advocate of change on this subject, as well as Senator Shaheen. And I think it denotes that we're building critical mass. And that's going to be essential on both sides of the aisle, because, again, this is the farthest thing from a partisan issue. This is all of our money. I don't know quite how many Americans are in the U.S. capital markets, but let's just say something in the neighborhood of 180 million. And this is really the nub of the problem. I mean, this is our money. This is not an abstraction. This isn't turning it over to somebody else for their responsibility. All of us have fund managers. All of us have financial planners. They may be faceless. You may not have a clue as to what's in your pension funds or mutual funds or index-derived funds. But believe me, it's worth finding out, because I can tell you, as you've already heard, those investments in Chinese companies are not just benign commercial entities. Many of the Chinese companies involved, and we'll get to the Thrift Savings Plan debacle shortly, but if we just take, for example, the MSCI All-Country World Index. Now, this is the particular index that's going to be used to benchmark the international shares of the Thrift Savings Plan, which is a $578 billion retirement system for the federal government and the American military that handles the funds of some 5.7 million of our federal citizens, federal employees. Now, mind you, this is not private money. Obviously, this is taxpayer money. So let's differentiate right now between private capital and our taxpayer capital. And that's what makes the Thrift Savings Plan, which is the focus of today's session, of a much larger set of issues, as Kyle Bass in particular pointed out. But we need to do something now on that score, because this decision by, there's a long name for it, by the Federal Retirement Thrift Investment Board, which I just will call in shorthand the TSP Board, the Thrift Savings Plan Board, for ease. They've made this decision for market-related reasons, to capture more companies in the investable universe of federal employees, sort of a technical, liquidity-oriented and yield-oriented set of considerations, which normally is the stock and trade, if you will, excuse the pun, of fund managers. But this time, when you go into emerging markets and away from developed countries where they are safely today, you encounter not just Chinese companies, but in some cases, national security and human rights corporate abusers. Now, let me give you just a couple of quick examples. When you sign on to the MSCI All Country World Index, you're forcing those federal employees who want some international exposure, which is a normal diversification strategy, almost under any circumstances, but this time they'll only have one choice, which is, again, a fund benchmark against that index, which happens to include a PLA-affiliated company called Aviation Industry Corp. What do they do for a living? Well, they produce a range of military aircraft, including fighters and UAVs, ship-launched anti-ship missiles, not very helpful for our Navy in the South, patrolling the South China Sea, trying to keep that waterway open and away from the fortresses that they've militarized on those illegal islands. It has been sanctioned by the United States on no less than 5 occasions for proliferation concerns. Now, if the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs and our combatant commanders around the world should happen to choose international exposure as part of their thrift savings plan, their own dollars will be supporting that company, not to mention the ones that I'll mention next. But you can see the irony here and the dangers unfolding. China Mobile, another one. 15 base stations constructed in the Paracel and Spratly Islands, including signals intelligence facilities and the like. You have the U.S. Federal Communications Commission that denied China Mobile its application to provide telecommunications services in this country because the company, quote, raises substantial national security and law enforcement risks, unquote. That's a federal government determination. Well, you can see what's going to happen to the chairman of the FCC when they discover in his portfolio or her portfolio, I confess I don't know the name off the cuff, but wouldn't it be ironic if there was that inconsistency with that individual's money? In the case of human rights, you'd have the privilege to invest in, unwittingly and on an undisclosed basis, Hike Vision Digital Technologies. Gee, what do they do for a living? Well, they're fundamental to what's called China's technological totalitarianism, the digital surveillance state. There are other terms of art being used for this. They are arguably the world's largest producer of security and video surveillance equipment, cameras, facial recognition technology, and the like. And you can see their cameras. They're deployed every few meters on the top of the walls of the concentration camps incarcerating 1 million or more. Some estimates are 2 million, 3 million Uyghurs, of the type that you can see from space. The same is true with the Tibetans at railroad stations who are picked up and detained by the facial recognition equipment of this company. Does Nancy Pelosi, who cares passionately to her credit for the plight of the Tibetans, have in mind her retirement dollars underwriting the suppression and the incarceration of those human rights of Tibetans that she champions? I don't think so. If you're looking for bipartisanship, you're seeing it right there. Let's move on. ZTE, practically a household name. I mean, how many times have they been sanctioned? They are a major U.S. sanctions violator. They have inappropriately shipped in particular to North Korea, but elsewhere as well. And the president had to save them from being put out of business when we were going to withhold all components to ZTE, but they are barred by federal agencies from any kind of procurement. So tell me, what are they doing or going to be doing if this decision's not reversed by the Thrift Savings Plan in the portfolios of the Congress, the executive branch, our uniformed military, our civilian military? What about China Unicom? What do they do? Well, they're the North Korea's sole internet service provider. They produce signals intelligence facilities or equip them in the South China Sea. CCCC, China Communications and Construction Corporation. They dredged the illegal islands in the South China Sea, and the list goes on. Now, mind you, this is a sampling. But we need some texture here, because we got to bring this thing to life. And we've got to understand that decision makers, policy makers in our country are going to be directly implicated here, whether they're human rights champions or whether they're part of the national security community of this country. So, the bigger problem is what's Kyle Bass and others have described here that's happening. There's $1 trillion of Chinese dollar-denominated bonds in our markets. There's probably up to $1 trillion or more of equities, that is, stocks. And there are over 700 Chinese companies in our markets. You know, they shop for the laxest regulatory regime. There may be only 86 to 100 or so in the New York Stock Exchange, maybe 65 or so in the NASDAQ. Over 500 are in the under-regulated, putting it generously, over-the-counter market. People can't even tell you what the over-the-counter market is, practically. Some folks don't even consider it part of the U.S. cap markets. But it's a fabulous free lunch program for China. But the greatest deal that they ever saw in their collective lives in Beijing are the indexes, or the indices. I don't know which one people prefer. But I like indexes because it keeps that index name, freshly on people's mind. Let's take the FTSE Russell index. What did they do in June? Well, they purchased out of the A-share market, which is right out of the mainland, Shenzhen and Shanghai exchanges, 1,097 Chinese companies, so that they could go viral, that they could instantly be moved into every healthy cell of the American body politic. What about the Bloomberg Barclays Global Aggregate Index, a bond index? I wonder how many funds under management they control. The answer is $54 trillion. So when they buy Chinese sovereign bonds or Chinese corporate bonds, read state-owned enterprises, boom, instantly, those entities receive a massive windfall courtesy of the American people. And mind you, bonds, we should remember, I give you this piece of paper with a maturity date written on it and an interest rate, and you give me discretionary cash that I can use as I alone deem indicated. Let's remember what bonds are and not get caught up in lingo here. Let's understand the fundamentals of what we're talking about here. Free cash flow. And we've already heard about the fact that the Chinese are receiving preferential treatment to our own companies. Dodd-Frank, non-compliant, no auditing of the type that is required for American firms. How does that work? Let's talk just Russia just for a moment here. They've got about 25 companies in our markets. Big difference from China, right? And where are 24 of them? Over-the-counter market again. Love that non-transparency, you know, to blur the picture. Isn't it interesting that 7 of the 24 there are under U.S. sanctions currently? Now catch this, you can't do business with them with a 100-foot pole, right? That's the idea. But you can invest in them. You can fund them. You can give them all of the prestige of being in the world's most prestigious capital markets, all of the multipliers and legitimatization that they could ask for. Is this just bad luck on our part? Is this just, well, we kind of missed that 40 to 60 trillion of funds under management over here and trying to make those consistent with the notion of U.S. sanctions? Or was there something more deliberate afoot? You know, protecting Wall Street, protecting the cap markets, making sure that we focus on the shiny object of trade. It's important, but China can play that game all day long. When's the last time any of you, and those going to see this video for that matter, when's the last time any of you heard about the national security and human rights dimensions of China's corporate presence and sovereign presence in our cap markets, in our capital markets? Gee, that's funny. Never. Not one article, not one cocktail party, not one hearing, not one interagency meeting in the executive branch. I just want that to settle in for just a moment. Could it be that that's where Beijing lives and dies, is the money? That's where the Soviets lived and died, was the money. It's when, believe me, I was there and an integral part of this, it's when we went after their hard currency cash flow. It's when we went after the credits, both government and private sector. It's when we had the Saudis pump 2 million barrels of more oil a day and we decontrolled prices at the wellhead, took oil down to $10 a barrel because of the paltry $32 billion a year that the Soviets made in hard currency income in 1982. Was going to be, devastated, because every dollar drop in the price of a barrel of oil was a $500 million to $1 billion hit for the Soviets. In those days, the subterranean problem, if you will, was natural gas. Nobody heard of pipeline politics. The Soviets wanted to dominate Western Europe's natural gas markets, and I'm getting to the analogy here, believe me. They were going to take, with the Siberian gas pipeline fully subscribed, they were going to take Western Europe 75% plus dependent on Soviet natural gas. Now, a few of us, myself and Bill Clark and the President of the United States, Ronald Reagan, realized that even though they had never used natural gas and weaponized it before, they would if they could, that's for sure, and splinter NATO in a way that makes today's situation look like the Elysian Fields. And that's why we took the stand that we did. That's why we put a limit and had blood all over the floor in the alliance in so doing on the level of dependency that we were going to permit Western Europe to have on Soviet natural gas deliveries to 30%. We're dealing with Nord Stream 2 today. The president himself has called Germany kind of a wholly owned subsidiary of Moscow because of natural gas sales. How would the president feel if it was 75 to 80% dependent, which is exactly where it would be had there been no Ronald Reagan? Now, how does this relate to China? Well, it's not natural gas that's subterranean. It's the trillions of dollars that they're putting in Chinese securities into our markets. So that 3 years from now, they're moving that money in and creating their own dependency to such a degree that 150, 180 million Americans are going to wake up 36 months from now, and they're going to look at their investment portfolios and their retirement accounts and their pension funds, and you know what they're going to find? 15%, 17%, 22% of their total portfolios are Chinese securities. What happens then? I'll tell you what happens. It's called checkmate, because that becomes a China lobby of vested interests that's going to oppose any kind of sanctions or penalties against China because of fear of damage to the value of their portfolios. We think of the strength of the China lobby today in American business and how influential they are, and they are. That's Mary Poppins next to what we're talking about. And the Chinese counted on the fact that this session would never be held, that this kind of awareness, this burgeoning movement, bipartisan, wouldn't happen. They can't afford it to happen, and they assumed that Wall Street and other fund managers would protect them on infinitum, unwittingly perhaps, but nevertheless, they could execute this plan. So there's more to talk about, but I would urge you to understand this battle of the Thrift Savings Plan needs to start for everyone in this room and everyone listening today. We cannot permit the companies that I just recounted to you, who they are, who they really are, what they do, the insidious nature of their activities, both as national security and human rights abusers. They cannot be in the portfolios of our military men and women. They cannot be in the portfolios of the cabinet, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, our combatant commanders, and too many others to name. That 5.7 million federal employees paid for with our money. We have to have that decision reversed now. And I'll just say that the executive branch, right up to the president, is going to have to engage, because otherwise, that 40 to 60 trillion is okay with this happening in the terms that I'm mentioning. No reversal, just let her go. Well, my closing comments to you are not on my watch and not on your watch. This is our money. Thank you.
Roger, thank you very much, as well as for your leadership on this really important issue. I think it's fair to say that had you not, in these settings, raised awareness about what is happening with our money, we almost certainly would not be having this conversation, certainly would not be in a position to act in time with respect to this ridiculous, reckless, and ultimately irresponsible decision by the Thrift Savings Plan. I am thrilled to tell you that we have with us someone who has spent much of his career in the securities industry. It's one thing for those of us who are national security practitioners, familiar with and active in the policy-making business, to be raising concerns as those we have shared with you so far. It's an altogether different thing to have someone who is actually an insider in the business, and we have such an individual today. His name is Chris Iacovella. Today, he is the Chief Executive Officer of the American Securities Association. But he has a long and very impressive pedigree of working in the business of global equities, national finance, including as the CEO of the Equity Dealers of America, which he founded. He has also served as a senior director of global government affairs, strategy, and public policy for a little company called Bloomberg. In addition, he has been a special counsel and policy advisor to a commissioner at the U.S. Commodity Future Trading Commission, Scott O'Malia, and also was seconded over to the Committee on Financial Services in the U.S. House of Representatives. He is, in short, a man who knows whereof he speaks about these vital topics, and we're very proud to have him with us. Chris, welcome.
Well, I'd like to thank you, Frank, Brian, and the committee for inviting me here today to speak about such an important issue. The mission of the American Securities Association rests on two pillars: to promote the trust and confidence of American investors and to help small businesses across this country access the capital they need to create jobs and grow the American economy. Allowing any American investor to put their hard-earned money into passive indexes that include Chinese companies who routinely avoid financial audits satisfies neither pillar of this mission, and it threatens America's economic and national security. As a result of the TSP decision, one group of Americans, U.S. government employees saving for retirement, will now be compelled to invest in unaudited Chinese companies instead of transparently audited small businesses right here in the United States. The TSP decision borders on fiduciary malfeasance because it ignores a fundamental tenet of our securities laws, and that's investor protection. In the wake of the Enron and WorldCom scandals, it's difficult for me to understand how we can allow American investors to be exposed to companies who are not audited and who continually avoid these financial audits, simply because the Chinese government claims that the information contained in them is a quote-unquote state secret. This claim is outrageous. At a minimum, U.S. investors, savers, and retirees will be the ones who suffer if these companies turn out to be frauds. And at worst, U.S. investor dollars are being used to fund the Chinese military and a cyber army that relentlessly attacks this country on a daily basis. And no matter how you slice it, this money would be much better spent funding America's small businesses and growing this economy. The index providers who include China A-share companies in their indexes have no idea whether these companies are frauds, arms of the Chinese military, or supporting human rights abuses. Their diligence process rests on Wall Street, pressuring them to include more Chinese companies in the indexes, because Wall Street knows this is a backdoor way around the SEC's company-specific disclosure and audit regime. And another question we should be asking is who exactly is pushing this agenda? And how much do they profit at the expense of American investors and small businesses? Is this the same group of mega Wall Street asset managers and index providers who push their social views of the world onto investors? And why are they suddenly so silent when it comes to American investor dollars flowing into opaque Chinese companies? I guess it turns out their profits and the need to pander to an adversarial nation are more important than the interests of American investors. Don't let the recent virtue signaling we've seen from their CEOs fool you. Taking the moral high ground on social issues stops at America's borders. I will leave you with this. Could you ever imagine a U.S. company pushing American investors into funds that included Russian companies during the Cold War? Absolutely not, because it's flat out wrong. America's Main Street investors and government employees should be investing in highly regulated, transparent businesses in the United States of America, not coerced by Wall Street to invest in unregulated companies in China. We call on the TSP board to immediately reverse its decision to force U.S. government employees to invest in any index that includes Chinese companies, because America's investors must not be a source of wealth that funds China's rise. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, for that. That was excellent. Thank you. Next, we have one of our other founders of the Committee on the Present Danger, a man who I would say has been as influential as anyone in the recent history of our country. He is a voice for both a new American populism, a new American common sense. He was one of the founders of this Committee on the Present Danger, and someone I'm very proud to call my friend. Steve Bannon is with us here today. Thank you, Steve.
Boy, talk about two tough acts to follow. That's absolutely amazing, Chris, the call out that you gave. You probably didn't see it, or maybe just recently did, but a few minutes ago, Bloomberg broke the story about the trade negotiations, and it looks like for some reason, the Americans, at least the way Bloomberg reports it, has put forward a proposal to kind of get into a two-step process. The old Chinese Communist Party, trap of doing something simple now and never getting to the main event later. Also this morning, I know this boggles the mind, but it's in the Bloomberg story, in quote, that it was the United States that decided to shift the beginnings of the next wave of tariffs from October 1st to October 15th, so that we could honor the celebration of the 70th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party's takeover of China. This is why what's happened here today and what the committee's been doing is so important. The American people don't have access to this information. This is not a conspiracy. This is in broad daylight. And I think what Chris just talked about is one of the most important things. The reason that this two-step process is being talked about is supposedly the administration and others on Capitol Hill in this city are worried about a potential recession before the 2020 election. There's a simple way to get the American economy to explode, and that is access to capital to American emerging growth companies. The single biggest problem every entrepreneur will tell you is the lack of bank financing and the lack of equity financing for emerging growth companies. Yet, as our esteemed colleagues have just walked us through in excruciating detail, we have unlimited financing for the Chinese Communist Party and their front organizations. And let's call it what it is. This is not about the Chinese people. The Chinese people are among the most hardworking, decent people on earth. If you want to see what the Chinese people can do with the rule of law and English common law, look at Hong Kong. They took a small fishing village and in 150 years built the third greatest capital market in the world with no resources but their own drive, determination, and grit, and the rule of law. Alibaba yesterday, Jack Ma stepped down after, 20 years, etc., and we now know he's a member of the Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese Communist Party removed him. They've killed the head of HNA, their biggest financial corporation. The head of Anbon Insurance Company is in a prison. The Chinese Communist Party controls every company in China. They make the decisions. And what we're talking about, the Frankenstein monster that we have to destroy, is created by the West. It's created by our capital. It's created by access to our technology, whether it's forced technology transfers, they stole it, or we sold it to them. As playing out in the streets of Hong Kong right now, these great young patriots, capitalists, who refuse to back down, patriots like in 1776 who will not back down to a tyranny, are fighting for the exact same thing the patriots in 1776 fought for. It is we, and you've seen today, and we're about to even get bigger with the Employment Savings Plan. We have financed all this. We've financed the surveillance technology. We have, actually, through the purchase of our bonds, our interest alone pays for the entire PLA. We've now allowed Huawei, which is a part of the PLA, it's not an associated company, we've allowed Huawei in throughout the entire West. If you didn't know the facts and understand how the system works, you would think this is some Kafkaesque nightmare. And why does it continue? It continues because there's a tremendous amount of money to be made. And the kids in Hong Kong are showing us every day as they get tear gassed and beaten and rubber bullets shot at them and the high pressure fire hoses and taken off and imprisoned. There's something more important than money. As a country, we're either going to stand for something or we're not. And one thing we can't stand for is to celebrate the 70th anniversary of the enslavement of the Chinese people. The priorities in this city are wrong because the priorities on Wall Street and corporate America are wrong. But where the priorities are not wrong is with working class and middle class people in this country. And that's why when this information gets put out there, you're going to see a sea change in this country about where political power lies. Donald Trump is president of the United States because of this issue. This issue is about the deindustrialization of our country. And working class people in the upper Midwest, they understand they don't need some big lecture. They don't need to sit in some Wall Street boardroom. They don't need to read the Financial Times. They understand the jobs got shipped to China and the opioid, the second opium war is being run on them in these towns in the Midwest. This is not a conspiracy. This is the way the system works. And what we have to do is go back to something very simple, which you laid out, Roger, you laid out. Hold people accountable. Where's the fiduciary responsibility of the elites in this country? The top accounting firms, the best law firms, the best investment banks, the best hedge funds. They all went to Harvard, they all went to Yale. I got my union card there, right? That's supposed to put you into some privileged class where you're supposed to have some obligations. The people with no accountability are the elites in this country. They have created that. And that is what the people in China and mainland China are enslaved. The people in Hong Kong and Taiwan are about to be enslaved unless they win their fight. This is not going to go away. This is the defining issue of our time, and there are many fronts on this, from the economic war to the currency war to the capital markets war, and it's only going to come with further and further exposure. But here's what the elites in this country have to know. You're seeing now a rising up of working class people and now professionals that are not going to back down. They're not going to back down for one simple reason. The future not just of our country and the freedom of the Chinese people, but the peace and prosperity of the entire world is going to hinge on this. We are going through a dark valley like the 1930s. And just like in the 1930s, unless people of goodwill and common sense bind together to fight this, we're going to be sucked into something that's going to be very ugly and very nasty. And it's totally in our control to stop it. I want to thank the committee. I want to thank Hillsdale. The three-day event you had the other day was magnificent, and you're seeing this start to get traction. I want to thank all the professionals that have been here. And you're seeing this gain momentum every day. Members of the media, this is the biggest story out there, and nobody covers it. Nobody covers it. And it's the reason that we can get into a situation of this. The reason that they want, that the Chinese Communist Party wants a two-step process is that these tariffs, President Trump's engagement in this economic war is bringing them to their knees. And their sponsors on Wall Street don't like it. Their sponsors in corporate America don't like it. And that's why it's going to depend upon us to stand up and fight it. Thank you very much.
Don't go away. We're going to ask the members of the committee and other presenters who have been with us today, as opposed to those who are joining us virtually, to come back and take questions if you have any for them. This is, I hope, an extraordinarily valuable opportunity for you to interact with and drill down on some of the points that have been made here that are, I think, of surpassing importance, and appreciate Steve's identifying it as a defining issue for this upcoming election, among other things. So Roger and Chris and Steve, if you would come up, and Brian, please. And we would be happy if you would raise your hand and identify yourselves if you do, in fact, have any questions for our speakers. We have a question from one of our speakers.
Well, a question from the chairman. Without Roger Robinson unveiling this and talking about it and informing both Congress and the Washington policy community, this issue doesn't get exposed anywhere, anyhow. Roger, maybe could you talk to the fact that so much of this has occurred under the radar, and that's part of the problem? There's, most people who are watching this are going to think, aren't there grown-ups in Washington or at the SEC or the White House or the Treasury Department who are going to protect Americans from this? Why are they not doing their job? And why did you have to be the one to explain to Americans this amazing fact?
Well, that's a very generous depiction of my role. I'm not trying to be the issue here, believe me. But at the same time, there's a problem on skill mix. We're looking at the nexus of national security and global finance. It turns out that's a problem, because the Wall Street luminaries view the national security community as sort of net disruptive. They're sanctions guys. They're contracting their investable universe. They're impeding the free flow of capital. They're trying to politicize the markets. They're not trying to facilitate a well-lubricated financial system. These guys are sort of gratuitous naysayers, ankle biters that lay awake at night trying to constrict their fees. May sound a bit harsh, but it may resonate with some of you. And the national security folks, God love them, they're patriots, they're trying to do the right thing, but generally speaking, their knowledge of the cap markets and global finance more broadly might be a millimeter deep. And they might have, received a briefing on it or something like that, but do they feel the confidence and depth to go out there on CNBC and take on these masters of the universe on Wall Street? I can tell you they don't, because they're worried about being depicted themselves as, quote, Neanderthals, unquote, or something as unflattering as that. So you don't have a lot of folks that come from Wall Street, as I had the privilege of doing. I certainly enjoyed my time there at Chase, but then move into, for the balance of my life, national security roles at senior levels. But the point is that skill mix permitted getting it in terms of the money. Whether we're talking about defunding the Soviet Union and knowing where all those dollars were, because we had to assess the credit worthiness So we knew that they had no money. We knew that the Western governments and banks were financing the hard currency cost of the entire external Soviet empire, for example, at the time about 16 billion. So in other words, then, once you get the Soviet code broken, you look at China, far more complex, but at the end of the day, here we are. It's about the money. Again, the shiny object, all of us concentrate on trade, not a peep over here, because that's where Beijing lives and dies. And so I would say regrettably that that's kind of our problem. And we need to train up, a whole new strata of professionals that get it, because this is 21st century national security. It's not kinetic. It's not, single-minded political military. It's a more sophisticated game, and China is eating our lunch. I mean, the index providers, okay? I know it's a little exotic, but this is common sense at the end of the day. I mean, my job and what I'm trying to do is to put this in layman's language of folks that are informed but uninitiated in all of this. So that's our common effort here. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. Any questions from you? Sasha Gong. Well, I'm going to turn this over to one of the best communicators I know, which is Steve Bannon. How would you tell this story for the workers in China as well as here?
First off, the headline is American working class and middle class finance Chinese Communist Party. Chinese Communist Party enslavement of Chinese workers. And for the workers in the regions of China, it's always held out. Look at the amazing economic miracle that China has had over the last 20, 30 years. That achievement is in spite of the Chinese Communist Party, not because of it. What they've done, if you look at the breakdown of wealth, there's 12 or 15 families inside the Chinese Communist Party that control everything. Their entire focus is using these front organizations like Anban Insurance Company, H&A, to launder their money out of China, away from pension funds and medical care and worker safety, into the West, into real estate in Midtown Manhattan. So it's very simple. For workers in both places, you're being scammed. Your money, the pension funds of the teachers and the EMT and the firemen and the police and the people in the factories, that money is being used to finance the enslavement of workers that are essentially undercutting wages all over the world, not to the workers' benefit, but to an elite in China, in the United States, in the city of London. This is why Elizabeth Warren, this is why populism is getting traction, and we're going to have two choices. You're going to have populist nationalism, you're going to have populist socialism. And one of the keys that picks the lock is the freedom of the folks enslaved in China by Western capital and Western technology used by these devils to enslave them. So here's the headline. Workers in America, unbeknownst to them, finance this, and workers in China are at the receiving end of this brutality, unbeknownst to both. Think you can work with that, Sasha?
Anybody else?
Yeah, I'd like to just take an answer on that. It's not the previous administration. They're part of it. Neil Bush is in China 2 days ago, right? Neil Bush from the Bush clan. And what is he saying? The United States has got to stay out of the internal matters of Hong Kong. This has nothing, the Obama administration has a lot to answer for, as does the Bush administration and the Clinton administration. This is the permanent political class. This is not about the politics of it. We have to come to a realization is that this is both Republican and Democrat. This is Wall Street and corporate America. And that's why you're seeing this rejection by the American people. So the only thing, French, is I just want to make sure, we just can't point to the Democrats and say it's their problem. When Neil Bush, a representative of the Bush family, stands on a stage in mainland China and says that the United States should butt out because what's happening in Hong Kong is an internal problem for the Chinese, and that we Americans have enough problems because of our racist past and all that, that is unacceptable. And the Bush apparatus, the Bush junta, still controls the apparatus of the Republican Party.
French, let me just bring Roger up if we can, because there are other people, I think, who want to have questions. If we could, please, just indulge me and allow me to move on. You asked a question. If we could just move along, please, because we do have a limit on our time. Thank you. Roger?
Yeah, very quickly, 20 years ago, roughly, 1999, 2000, China National Petroleum Corporation came to the New York Stock Exchange for the largest IPO in New York Stock Exchange history, or what was to have been, at $10 billion. And some of us looked at that company 20 years ago and found that they were 40% of the Greater Nile Petroleum Operating Company, took 50% of Sudan's oil, thousands of people on the ground. 2 million had already been killed in Sudan, a genocidal regime, and we mobilized a range of organizations, mainly left of center, human rights groups, AFL-CIO, International Campaign for Tibet. It's a long list. 25 million Americans in the NGO community were mobilized to go to institutional investors and others and say, you are aiding and abetting genocide if you play this game. Goldman was leading the issue. They tried a little name change to PetroChina, which today is listed on the New York Stock Exchange. But the long and short of it is that that activism, those counter roadshows, reduced that deal from 10 billion to 2.89 billion, and China had to go to Li Ka-shing in Hong Kong, their little friend there, billionaire, and they gave BP gas station concessions to have anything. And it took down, in a cascading fashion, half of China's total fundraising in the United States in the year 2000. Now, that was just a little cadre, less than one hand, of people that were organizing this juggernaut. That's how thin the skin is in the money category. Then 20 years passed, zero, and here we are now. So, unfortunately, no lessons particularly were learned, but there's hope in the system. You know, I'll just leave you with a thought. We dominate the economic and financial domain on the planet Earth. Our capital markets are roughly the size of the rest of the world's combined. China's playing in our sandbox. We're not playing in theirs. Have no mistake about our leverage. Have no mistake now about our resolve.
Thank you, Roger. Chris, I had to absent myself partly through your remarks. I just want to make sure one point that I think you could answer is addressed. If you have already done so, skip it. But let's just say, as a former Defense Department employee, like hundreds and hundreds of thousands of others, uniformed as well as, in my case, civilian, I'm putting money into the Thrift Savings Plan, and I don't want my money to go to these kinds of companies that Roger and you have talked about, the human rights abusers, the national security threats, and the like. Do I have that option once the Thrift Savings Plan has implemented the decision that they took starting in January?
The answer is no, absolutely not. If you want international exposure, you're going to be compelled to fund Chinese companies, period.
How does that work?
You will have to buy into a fund which references these indexes, which include Chinese A-shares companies, which we have discussed already. And once those companies receive the funding through the index and more money comes into the index provider goes and buys more and more and more of shares in these companies. So the money goes from the TSP plan to the fund into shares of these companies who we have no idea what they do. And so the answer is you have no choice if the TSP continues to move forward with its current plan. And again, this is a huge first step here. If the TSP reverses this decision, it should send a loud shockwave throughout the rest of America and financial advisors everywhere to start looking at portfolios. There's ways to get access to global markets, ex-China. And if there isn't, then they will be created because there will be a demand for it. And that's what we need to have happen here.
Thank you very much. Any other question? Yes, sir. Chris or Roger, do you want to?
Quick thought. As I was saying a bit earlier, the arguments best I know, and the ones that I've heard repeatedly, because I've been in this business quite a while, we're contracting their investable universe. No, you don't have to engage with national security and human rights abusers. You can even choose a more benign commercial Chinese company if you wish. But for goodness sake, don't do so with someone, with an entity or its subs that have a track record like the ones I was explaining. That doesn't contract your investable universe. The free flow of global capital? Wait a minute. These are material risks to share value and corporate reputation. In fact, they're asymmetric material risks in many cases. This is prudent 101 in terms of investors having a right to know where their money's going, how it's being used, the identities of these entities, and a list, literally, in the risk section of the prospectus of the kind of material risks that are in play so that they can make a properly informed investment decision. So don't talk to me about the free flow of capital. I'm talking about how capitalism is supposed to function. Then there's the politicization of the markets. It's like we're gratuitously going after tobacco or guns or environment. That's not so. This isn't some kind of social or preference or even values or a moral compass. No. Again, we got to come back to the market. These are material risks. It's a fact. You know, when companies are written up in the Wall Street Journal to have surveillance cameras on the walls of concentration camps, their stock falls. That's just the way it is. Or when somebody is sanctioned for proliferation, look at ZTE, look at Huawei. You think their stock didn't go down? You think their corporate reputation wasn't savaged? Guess who picks up the tab for that? The unwitting investor who didn't have a clue as to the true identities and activities of these Chinese entities. And the list goes on, but those are the main arguments that we're going to hear. And guess what this is about? This is about fear-mongering. You're going to hear that the sky is falling. You're going to hear that we, by the TSP decision alone, the Thrift Savings Plan reversal alone, that we're trying to wreck a great thing. We're trying to, and another one, impede the competitiveness of the U.S. exchanges, that the Chinese will go somewhere else. You know, Frankfurt, London, Singapore. There is nowhere else. There's nobody that has the volume and depth of our markets. There's nowhere to go. This is one of the great last monopolies of the United States in the 21st century. We have all the money, basically. We can do this alone. We don't even need allies. It's nice to have them, and Japan's one of them, because they have 20% of the world's investable capital, and they're basically on the team. So that's where we are. And that's how to refute this fear-mongering. Well, it's still fairly new, and they're studying it. They're trying to take, I don't even know if there have been interagency meetings on it, to be precise. I know that there are certain agencies of the American government that are not keen on having to grapple with this. One such agency begins with a T. And so the point is that you do not have full concurrence within the administration. That's a kind way to put it. And some folks are saying, you know, don't get in my lane. You know, they don't want the human rights and national security types harping on this matter. So that's part of the problem, but I think we can resolve it.
I think simply put, it's a search for yield and a search for return. Yield on debt instruments and return on equities. These bonds have certain yields, and the equities have had certain returns. Now, we're doing tons of analysis with Roger to show that on the equity side particularly, the returns have not been there. In fact, it's been almost a scam. But you got to remember, where from Chris's perspective, what's holding back American entrepreneurs of Chinese descent in the United States is Dodd-Frank on the lending side and Sarbanes-Oxley on the equity side. Every entrepreneur in this country has to, on the equity side, go through all the perturbations of Sarbanes-Oxley, right? And on the debt side with Dodd-Frank. These Chinese, the companies of the CCP don't. And that's what it's just to be a fiduciary. And we feel when they have to play on the level playing field of American companies, a lot of this scam's going to come up. You're going to see a lot of this if you do your fiduciary responsibility, that on the yield side, that these bonds really can't pay back over time. And the equities are not what they purport to be. And that's what Roger and others in this group are trying to press forward. On this multidimensional war, this economic war that we're engaged in with the Chinese Communist Party, the capital markets and the currency part are far greater, and the technology than the trade part. Remember, I said 6 weeks ago or 8 weeks ago, Huawei is 10 times more important than what's happening on trade, and trade is very important. And no, the administration, the Treasury Department, and this gets back to French's comments, is that in administrations past, the Treasury Department, I think, reports more to Wall Street than they do to the President of the United States. And it shouldn't be lost on anybody that our Secretary of the Treasury said 4 weeks ago, hey, we're 90% of the way there on a deal. 90% of the way there on a deal that to me is not 2% of the way there. And said the other day that we're already there as far as the enforcement mechanism, right? Just more cheerleading, you know, from the bleachers on Wall Street. So simply put, this is about the search for yield and it's about search for return. And what we're saying is that when you peel the mask off, it's a total scam. And the American people don't understand that yet because it hasn't been explained to them in the power that Roger, Chris, and others are starting to put forward this information, and the media is now just starting to pick it up. But once that's out there, I think people are going to come to the conclusion we can't continue like this.
It seems to me the best argument for doing this, for the TSP, for investing in Chinese corporations, is made by Wall Street, right? And their argument is it's a global economy. Whatever we can do to intertwine both of our economies together, our people together, is going to make for a better, more productive world. This was rejected in 2016 with the election of Donald Trump. That globalist view was rejected. He has spent the last 2.5 years doing everything in his power to hold China to account. If President Trump were presented with this issue of the TSP or the Chinese penetration of U.S. capital markets, I believe he would reject it outright. It would make sure that his administration did not allow this to occur. But to the extent that this flies under the radar, then it goes along, and it takes private individuals and the committee and others to try to highlight this. Not only, as Steve said, are they bad investments, and there's very little scrutiny done of these Chinese companies, but at the end of the day, they're competing with U.S. corporations that are trying to raise capital. The president and the media are very concerned about the trade deficit. What about the deficit that's created by allowing Chinese corporations into our capital markets? That alone is going to slow down economic growth in such a way that is counterproductive. And again, if presented to the president, his natural instinct, I believe, would be to oppose this with every bone in his body. And part of our effort here today is to explain this to the American people in such a way that they'll understand it and present that to their friends and colleagues and their elected representatives.
Steve, I know you have to go. Thank you very much. Let me just add one further point. I think Roger touched on it earlier, but I think it's another argument that we're going to hear from Wall Street in defense of this kind of behavior. And that is the claim that to do otherwise is to politicize decision-making in the capital markets. And I would simply suggest this isn't political. This is national security. And if we persist in, as I said at the very beginning, allowing our enemies to finance the threat that they pose to us in substantial measure, some of it quite literally by enabling them to buy the military equipment with which to attack us. That isn't political, that is, well, yes, crazy, reckless, but at complete odds with the national security interests of the United States. And it's past time, it seems to me, and I think to our team at the Committee on the Present Danger of China, that we stop giving Wall Street a pass. The kind, and I think, Chris, you sort of touched on this as well as Roger, this would have been unthinkable during the Cold War. Well, there were some people who thought about it and tried to do it, but fortunately people like Roger kept them from getting away with it. But it should be unthinkable today as well. And our conviction is if the American people are simply aware this is happening, to say nothing of military personnel whose money is going to be applied to buy the weapons with which to kill them in the first instance, for example, or other patriotic government employees, this isn't going to happen. But it does need to break through the suppressing fire of Wall Street. Yes, ma'am. Great. Very important questions. And you're speaking to precisely the reaction that I think we'll see throughout both, again, the civilian and defense military community. Chris, might I ask you to address that question of what kind of responsibility does the oversight board of the Thrift Savings Plan have, A, to take these kinds of factors into consideration, and B, to make sure that their investors, their pension fund, investors are acquainted with this kind of information?
Well, just like a lot of you, the TSP board was new to us as we did some research on it. It was set up by statute. It is an independent agency with 5 board members and a permanent executive director. 3 of the board members are a part of whoever is in power in the presidency, and the other 2 are in the minority. And so that's why this decision there needs to be external pressure from Congress and from others in the administration to let them know that this is unacceptable. Do they have an obligation to tell you? Yes, I'm sure they do, and I'm sure that they said, we are going to expand your investable universe, and didn't go into the details of what was in that investable universe. And it really is up to TSP plan participants to demand more information and to reject this, because if there's an uprising from within service members and federal employees across the government that rejects this, I think they have to listen, and I think they will.
Thank you very much. I think we're going to have to bring this to a conclusion. I want to thank Chris Iacovella, Roger Robinson, Brian Kennedy, Steve Bannon, and all of our other speakers and participants. I just wanted to round this out with a couple of quick points. One being to your answer just now, Chris, that would be especially true if you have no choice as a military member of the armed forces. No choice. Once this decision is made, there will be only whatever the MSCI serves up, whatever they decide on the basis of expanding the investable universe. And if that means you're underwriting the people who are trying to kill you, getting the weapons with which to do it more efficiently, tough, I guess, is the answer. And that is obviously unacceptable. Just a couple of other quick points. We have, I think, hopefully impressed upon all of you that this does constitute, this specifically with respect to the Thrift Savings Plan and more broadly with respect to the kind of investments millions of us are making in the MSCI and Fidelity and other groups. Is Fidelity one of the other ones? What, BlackRock? Arming or otherwise enabling our enemy is irresponsible in the extreme, and the fact that Wall Street has continued to do it for so long and that the effects are now becoming more and more ominous is something that, again, the American people have to be acquainted with. The fact that there is no national security or human rights screen, either in the Thrift Savings Plan process or in the Wall Street one. is clearly unacceptable. The Securities and Exchange Commission is not providing that screen. There is an Office of Global Security Risk, I understand, thanks to earlier work by Roger Robinson. It's AWOL on this fight. That's intolerable. And I just want to close with this one point, which it seems to me, just again, Sasha, if you're looking for how do you get this across to people whose eyes may glaze over with a lot of these acronyms and the confusing nature of these portfolio management decisions and so on, it's this. If your pension funds are tied up in companies that the People's Liberation Army or the security services of China, or simply the Chinese Communist Party, which run them all, can manipulate, devalue, or otherwise imperil at will, you invariably will have a vested interest in trying to prevent that from happening. What does that mean? Does that mean, as a practical matter, that you will be a lobbyist for Communist China to ensure that nothing like that happens to your personal net worth? Well, it's hardly unreasonable to say the answer would probably be yes for lots of people. But think about this, just to put a very fine point on it, as Tara has talked about from a personal perspective. I had security clearances a long time ago. I think it's still true today, but certainly was then, that if you were to put on your application for a security clearance, which you need to have in most jobs in the military and a lot of civilian positions in the Pentagon, and elsewhere in our government, by the way, this isn't confined to the Defense Department. Anybody who needs a security clearance to perform their duties in the government of the United States, if they wrote on their application, "I am doing business with Communist China," would almost certainly, I pray it's still the case, it certainly was in the day, be denied the clearance required for them to do those official functions, and properly so. And yet, the Thrift Savings Plan Board is at the cusp of putting every single serving member of the United States military and civilian government personnel who have clearances or would apply for them at risk. I think those employees, past for sure as well, but certainly present, have a need to know that this is in the works. And if, as I think they will respond to that kind of information as Tara has, by saying, hell no, then we need to shut this down. And we need to shut it down now, and it's the president's duty most immediately, his responsibility and his opportunity to prevent this particular travesty from playing out. And I hope, as you've said, Chris, if he does so, that it will have a very therapeutic effect on money managers and financial advisors throughout our system. And hopefully, before it's too late, avoid creating that China lobby and further empowering the present danger from China. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you to those of you who've done so virtually. Thank you to our great speakers. Well done. God bless you all.